Summer 1942. While World War II raged across the Eastern Front and the Atlantic sea lanes, another struggle was unfolding in a land of sand and wind, North Africa. There, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was not only fighting the enemy in front of him, he was being forced to play a brutal game where the rules were written by the desert itself. On the battlefield, Rommel was in his element. Against the British Eighth Army, war felt direct and personal. Movement, surprise, nerve. Here he fought with instinct and speed, reading the ground and the enemy's reactions like a gambler reading faces across a table. And at key moments, he could bend the situation to his will through speed, surprise, and bold decision-making. But at the same time, the desert began to strike back in silence. Every mile, his panzers moved forward and pushed fuel, ammunition, and spare parts farther behind them. Trucks broke down. Many supply ships were intercepted and sunk in the Mediterranean, often before their cargo could be delivered to Rommel's forces in North Africa. What Rommel gained in a few hours of fighting, distance quietly erased over the next few weeks. It was not only a war of courage or command, but increasingly a war of numbers, where logistics and distance shaped the outcome. And far away in Berlin, another war was being fought, one Rommel could barely touch. North Africa was never Germany's main strategic priority, especially as Berlin focused increasingly on the war against the Soviet Union. While Rommel struggled to survive in the desert, Germany's leaders kept looking east, pouring men, machines, and attention into the massive war against the Soviet Union. Africa became a secondary stage, where victories were praised, but only limited and delayed reinforcements followed. Rommel could win battles, he could outthink his opponent and flip the moment when defeat seemed close. But there were things even a genius could not command. He could not order the desert to become shorter, and he could not order Berlin to look south instead of east. So what happens when a commander keeps winning fights but keeps losing days? When every step forward makes the road behind him even longer? North Africa was not where Rommel was defeated in a single dramatic moment. It was where his victories began to carry the price of defeat. And that price would decide the fate of the Desert Fox in the months ahead. By January 1941, the North African theater appeared close to collapse for the Axis. Even though the campaign itself was far from truly finished, British-led forces had consistently pushed back Italian troops, captured Tobruk, and now threatened Tripoli itself. Italian morale had collapsed after months of defeat, poor leadership, and outdated equipment that failed again and again in open desert fighting. One captured soldier reportedly kicked his disabled tank in frustration and told his captives, "No good like everything Italian." His comment reflected not just anger, but a deeper loss of faith in Italy's ability to fight a modern war. Mussolini approached Hitler with a humiliating request: "Save us." For the Italian dictator, the situation was desperate, because another collapse would expose Italy as the weak link of the Axis and risk domestic instability. For Hitler, however, North Africa was strategically unimportant. His eyes were already turning toward the Soviet Union, and he viewed the Mediterranean as a secondary theater at best. But Italian collapse could shatter the Axis alliance and embarrass Germany publicly. In early 1941, Hitler issued limited instructions for North Africa, ordering German forces to hold Tripolitania and stabilize the front, because Berlin wanted to prevent an Italian collapse without committing major resources. Just hold it, nothing more. It was meant to be a defensive mission, short in scope and low in cost. He sent General Leighton and Erwin Rommel, a rising star who had led the 7th Panzer Division during France's 1940 collapse. His division had earned the nickname Gespenster Division, Ghost Division, for materializing behind enemy lines when least expected, often moving faster than German headquarters could track. Rommel's reputation was built on speed, initiative, and bold decision-making, traits that had brought success in Europe, but would soon clash with cautious orders from Berlin. But in North Africa, Rommel wasn't supposed to attack. His Afrika Korps operated as a Sperrverband, a blocking detachment under formal Italian command, and its purpose was to stabilize the front, not to change it. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht forbade any advance beyond reconnaissance patrols because Berlin wanted no distraction from preparations in the east. Rommel found a loophole because the orders restricted planned offensives, not sudden exploitation of enemy weakness. In March 1941, with forces inferior to the British Eighth Army, Rommel attacked. The British hadn't expected an offensive until May, and their units were spread thin across wide distances, confident that Axis forces needed time to reorganize. After months fighting demoralized Italians, they were exhausted and overconfident. Rommel's panzers appeared behind static defenses, spreading panic and confusion, and British command cohesion quickly broke down. The British withdrew from Cyrenaica in disorder. Only Tobruk, defended by Australian infantry, held out, becoming a symbol of resistance rather than a stopping point for Rommel's momentum. German high command in Berlin, including officers such as Franz Halder, pressed for Rommel to halt his advance because planners feared overextension and supply collapse more than immediate British resistance. German planners feared overextension more than enemy counterattack. At the end of his supply lines, with ports distant and roads fragile, Rommel besieged Tobruk, hoping to take it quickly before logistics collapsed. British Major General Donald Bateman observed the transformation with concern. He noted that German soldiers possessed confidence the Italians had lost, and that confidence changed battlefield behavior. The Italians last year lost confidence in their weapons. One Italian prisoner kicked his CV-3 tank in frustration and told his captives, "No good like everything Italian. The Germans are not likely to do the same." Morale, he understood, was now a decisive weapon. Rommel's insubordination infuriated Berlin's commanders, who feared chaos if others followed his example. But Hitler was jubilant. Hitler promoted Rommel and expanded his authority over Axis forces in North Africa, which gave him strong influence over both German and Italian units, even though Italian command structures remained in place. This strengthened the direct relationship between Rommel and Hitler, bypassing normal command structures and increasing Rommel's freedom, but also his dependence on Hitler's favor. The Desert Fox was becoming the dictator's favorite general. But being Hitler's favorite guaranteed praise, not supplies, because admiration could not replace fuel, trucks, or spare parts. Rommel's successors created expectations that logistics could not meet. On June 22, 1941, whatever attention North Africa commanded evaporated. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa consumed every resource Germany could muster: men, fuel, rail capacity, and political focus. Hitler decreed the Libyan war would continue after Barbarossa succeeded, treating North Africa as a problem that could simply wait. Rommel's victories would need to wait for someone else's war to end. They never would. General Sir Claude Auchinleck had no intention of waiting. The Tobruk garrison had endured months of siege, disease, and constant artillery fire, and British leadership understood that time favored the Axis if nothing changed. On November 18, 1941, the Eighth Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the Eighth Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks,
and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the 8th Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the 8th Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the 8th Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the 8th Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the 8th Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the 8th Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the Eighth Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the Eighth Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the Eighth Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the Eighth Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise and forcing him to react instead of dictate events. Heavy armored clashes erupted throughout the desert, especially around Sidi Rezeg airfield, where both sides committed tanks in confused, fast-moving battles that tested command and control as much as firepower. Despite initial setbacks, German troops gained the upper hand in several engagements. British armor suffered losses in scattered attacks, and coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery often broke down. Rommel sensed the decisive moment had arrived, believing that British morale was fragile and that one bold stroke could undo the entire Allied offensive before it fully developed. On November 24, 1941, the Eighth Army surged forward under Operation Crusader, taking Rommel by surprise.
Rommel had tactical initiative and better tanks. The British had absolute refusal to quit. El Alamein wasn't just another position. With the Mediterranean Sea north and the impossible Qattara Depression south, the front narrowed to only 40 kilometers. This geographical bottleneck eliminated the wide expanses where Rommel maneuvered his panzers like ships at sea. At El Alamein, there was nowhere to maneuver. Victory would go to whichever side could sustain attrition longer. And in attrition wars, the side with more supplies always wins. Rommel had driven his army into a geographic cage. Churchill pushed Auchinleck to strike quickly, but Auchinleck warned that the Eighth Army was exhausted. So London replaced him as Middle East commander with General Harold Alexander, and it also appointed Bernard Law Montgomery to lead the Eighth Army. Montgomery realized Auchinleck was right,
The Eighth Army needed rest and retraining. More importantly, El Alamein was in a strong defensive position. Montgomery just needed patience. British signal intelligence revealed Rommel's late August plan. He intended to attack in the south, break through, then wheel north to encircle the Eighth Army. Montgomery decided to let him try. He would force Rommel's panzers toward Alamhala, a strong point bristling with dug-in tanks and artillery. When the Axis attack opened August 30th, Rommel drove into the trap. Losses were high on both sides, but the German assault failed. With health worsening, Rommel returned to Germany to recuperate. Before dismissal, Auchinleck had issued a prophetic memo. There exists a danger that our friend Rommel is becoming a kind of magician or bogeyman to our troops who are talking far too much about him. He is by no means a Superman, although he is undoubtedly very energetic and able. I wish for you to dispel by all possible means the idea that Rommel represents something more than an ordinary German general. By failing at El Alamein, Rommel began dispelling that myth himself. Montgomery's second battle of El Alamein opened October 23rd with massive artillery bombardment. The main obstacle was getting through extensive minefields. British-led units made progress, but the attack wasn't flawless. Units advanced at different speeds. Mine clearing took time. German anti-tank guns inflicted heavy tolls. But Germans also suffered irreplaceable losses. On October 24, 1942, General Georg Stummer, who was acting commander while Rommel was away, died during a frontline visit, and many accounts say he likely suffered a heart attack. November 2nd, Montgomery ordered Operation Supercharge to break through positions around Kidney Ridge. The limited frontage eliminated elegant maneuver possibilities. Montgomery told commanders it would be frontal assault. According to accounts from officers present, he said, "It's got to be done. If necessary, I'm prepared to accept 100% casualties in both personnel and tanks." This crystallized the campaign. Montgomery could afford total losses because Britain could replace them. Rommel couldn't counter an enemy willing to pay any price with resources to afford it. After the breakthrough, Rommel ordered a withdrawal, but Hitler sent a stand-fast message on November 3rd, and Rommel hesitated before he finally pulled back on November 4th, because he believed staying would destroy his army. He withdrew toward Tunisia, choosing survival over loyalty. A captured German NCO wrote bitterly, "The English have artillery that really should not be allowed, full stop." By 1943, according to post-war analyses, the British could fire approximately 30 shells for every German shell. Technical excellence couldn't overcome that arithmetic. November 8, 1942, Anglo-American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria as Operation Torch. Rommel now fought a two-front battle. This landing marked a decisive shift in the war's geography because for the first time, large American ground forces entered the Mediterranean theater in strength. Until this moment, Rommel had faced pressure mainly from the east, where the British Eighth Army advanced across the desert. Torch suddenly created a second axis of threat from the west, compressing Axis forces into Tunisia and turning maneuver space into a narrowing trap rather than an open battlefield. Operation Torch represented serious American entry into the European war. For Rommel, it meant supply lines through Tunisia were threatened from behind. Unlike earlier desert campaigns, where long but predictable supply routes could be managed with careful planning, Tunisia forced Axis logistics into short, vulnerable corridors. Ports, rail lines, and roads were now within range of Allied air power from both directions, and every shipment of fuel or ammunition became a calculated risk. Rommel understood that without secure supply, tactical victories would lose meaning, because tanks without fuel and guns without shells could not exploit success. In Tunisia, Axis commanders grew pessimistic. Mountainous terrain denied Rommel's maneuver methods. His superiors took increased control, ordering him to hold the Mareth Line, an outdated French position. Wehrmacht Commander-in-Chief South Albert Kessler remained confident, but Rommel lacked forces. The Marath Line, built before the war, had been designed for static defense rather than mobile warfare, and it forced Rommel into a role he disliked and did not trust. Holding ground replaced striking at weak points, and initiative shifted upward to distant headquarters. Kessler believed discipline and air support could stabilize the front, but Rommel saw that numbers, fuel shortages, and Allied coordination made such confidence unrealistic. By January 1943, Montgomery told his commanders the breakthrough would be costly, and he made it clear that the army would keep pushing even with heavy losses, because he believed British industry and supply could replace what Rommel could not. This decision reflected more than battlefield results. It showed growing frustration within the German command system. Rommel's reputation remained strong, but Berlin increasingly viewed North Africa as a liability rather than an opportunity. Removing him signaled an attempt to control the situation administratively, even as the military reality continued to deteriorate. The Allies advanced systematically. Tripoli fell January 23, 1943. With it went any realistic hope of maintaining supply lines. Germany's strategic fate in Africa was sealed. The fall of Tripoli removed the last major port supporting Axis forces from the west, and from that moment, defeat was a matter of time rather than possibility. Allied logistics improved daily, while Axis shortages deepened, creating an imbalance no battlefield skill could correct. On March 9, 1943, Rommel flew to Germany, effectively removed from command. Behind him, he left approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers facing inevitable defeat. His departure symbolized the end of the Afrika Korps as an offensive force. Those left behind fought on with professionalism, but without hope of relief, evacuation, or strategic reversal. On May 12, 1943, Tunis fell to the Allies, and on May 13th, the remaining Axis forces in North Africa surrendered, which ended the campaign. Hans Klein of the Hermann Göring Division recalled, "The ambushment the Americans threatened for the next morning never happened. Then we broke our small arms over a tree. My company was singing as we threw the stocks and bolts of our weapons in all directions. We hadn't had anything to eat for a couple of days, since there was nothing coming through. The water supply was good, but there was no ammunition to continue the fight." This memory captures the psychological end of the campaign, where fear gave way to exhaustion and even relief. Surrender was no longer shameful, but practical. The Afrika Korps' higher safari battle cry ended with singing soldiers breaking rifles over trees because they had nothing left to shoot. What began as a symbol of speed and confidence ended quietly, not in heroic last stands, but in empty hands and broken weapons. The numbers were brutal, because roughly 250,000 or more Axis soldiers became prisoners in Tunisia alone, and the Axis also lost most of its heavy equipment.
So the campaign ended as a major strategic disaster. For comparison, the German Sixth Army lost about 300,000 at Stalingrad. North Africa represented a comparable catastrophe in a theater Hitler considered a sideshow. Yet this sideshow consumed men, machines, and time Germany could not replace, proving that even secondary theaters can deliver decisive strategic defeat when logistics, geography, and coalition warfare align against a single commander's brilliance. Tanks defined North African warfare unlike any other theater. The vast-scale battles fought across hundreds of square kilometers meant mechanized movement was essential. Rommel saw his panzers as ships at sea, operating in fluid formations. This vision worked until geography eliminated the open ocean. British tanks dominated before the Afrika Korps arrived. The Matilda II, with frontal armor up to about 78 millimeters, was largely impervious to Italian anti-tank guns during the early fighting in North Africa.
Though slow, making just 11 kilometers per hour cross-country, this limited mobility increased crew time in conditions described as nearly unbearable, where internal tank temperatures could exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit, creating extremely harsh conditions for the crews. The Matilda and Vickers cruiser Mark I met their match when German tanks arrived. Initially, the Afrika Korps fielded mostly Panzer IIs and IIIs, with smaller numbers of Panzer IVs. Most had short-barreled guns, effective against infantry but less so against armor. For anti-tank roles, German forces introduced improved models such as the Panzer IIIJ with a long 50mm gun and the Panzer IV F2, which mounted an effective long-barreled 75mm gun. British forces increasingly relied on American tanks, first the M3 Grant, later the M4 Sherman. Both mounted 75mm guns that were highly effective against infantry and fortifications, while offering adequate but not superior performance in anti-tank combat. Britain also introduced Churchill with a 6-pounder gun and Upguard Crusader Mark V. Rommel eventually received Tiger tanks protected by frontal armor up to about 100mm. The Tiger tank combined heavy protection with strong firepower. Its 88mm gun gave impressive long-range capability. According to some accounts, a Tiger tank achieved a Sherman kill at a range of about 2,700 meters. Major Ludd of the 501 Panzer Section noted in reports, "We must do all we can to put purebred Tiger units into action." However, Tigers had minimal impact. By the time they arrived in numbers, fighting had moved to Tunisian mountains, where close ranges eliminated their long-range advantage. According to after-action reports, Tigers struggled in rainy season mud. They also worsened supply problems. A single Tiger consumed several liters of fuel per kilometer, placing heavy strain on already limited Axis supply systems. Some historians suggest German technical superiority was marginal. How tanks were used mattered more than specifications. British tanks largely operated as separate units. Rommel used combined arms boxes, integrating panzers, artillery, engineers, and anti-tank guns. When attacked, the box halted. Tanks moved to sides. Anti-tank weapons stopped enemy armor, while panzers maneuvered to flanks. British tanks often made frontal charges. Panzers prioritized fire and mobility. Commonwealth commanders recommended 3-to-1 numerical advantage to successfully assault German positions. The British adapted by Elamine. They developed better infantry armor cohesion. They shifted anti-tank priority to artillery. New 6-pounder guns were more potent and easier to camouflage. Even 25 pounder howitzers could serve in anti-tank roles. By 1943, according to post-war analyses, British forces could fire approximately 30 shells for every German shell. Overwhelming superiority reflecting industrial capacity rather than technical innovation. Rommel blamed defeat on lack of supplies, air attacks, Italian performance, and Eighth Army superiority. How accurate was this? He wrote bitterly, "The bravest of men cannot fight without a gun. The best guns are worthless without ammunition, and in mobile warfare, guns and ammunition are virtually worthless if they cannot be moved around in vehicles with enough petrol." Some estimates suggest Rommel received only 40% of needed supplies between January and August 1942. According to accounts from staff officers, he began to believe professional jealousy prevented supplies from Europe. Supply was certainly critical. Rommel's army was the only significant Axis force supplied entirely over water. British-controlled Malta made this brutally difficult. The desert scale and lack of ports meant success created longer supply lines. More fuel was consumed transporting supplies than could be delivered to combat units. Hitler made promises, but reality was harsh. According to logistical analyses, resupplying a division in Africa required approximately 10 times the transport of one on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, Britain had Alexandria's well-developed port with constant supply via the Cape of Good Hope and Suez Canal. However, historians Vincent O'Hara and Enrico Conosci, analyzing shipping records, argue that about 84% of supplies shipped to North Africa arrived at Axis ports. Though these historians acknowledge Rommel considered his allowance a minimum for defensive operations, 90% of minimum isn't enough for offensive operations. Critically, supplies arriving in ports didn't necessarily reach frontline units. There was a chronic lack of trucks. According to accounts from logistics officers, supplies might sit in Tripoli while panzers ran dry at the front. Giuseppe Mancinelli, the Africa Corps' Italian liaison officer, observed that Rommel habitually blamed Italians. Rommel argued poor Italian combat performance increased German troops' burden. However, Italian units formed significant portions of Rommel's force. Some historians suggest Italian efforts enabled Rommel's 1941 victories by weakening the Eighth Army first. Italian signal intelligence apparently provided vital assistance to Mediterranean convoys. Later, according to accounts from officers present, Rommel expressed sympathy after losing the Ariete division. In the Ariete, we lost our oldest Italian comrades, from whom we had probably always demanded more than they, with their poor armament, had been capable of performing. British forces faced similar multinational challenges. Their force included British, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, South African, Greek, French, and Senussi soldiers. Early British command reportedly experienced tensions between officers of different backgrounds, but Britain could afford to work through problems because they had adequate supplies. Rommel didn't have that luxury. In early campaigns, Rommel counted on Luftwaffe support, but as the campaign progressed, more Luftwaffe resources went elsewhere, bombing Malta, defending Germany, supporting the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, the Desert Air Force concentrated exclusively on supporting the Eighth Army. By August 1942, according to operational records, the RAF had decisively won air superiority, enabling systematic attacks on Axis positions and supply lines. Rommel's defeat stemmed from multiple factors: supplies, geography, multinational command tensions, two-front campaign, and arguably his own command style. But one critical difference mattered most: the theater's relative strategic importance. For Hitler, North Africa was always a sideshow. In early 1941, Berlin gave North Africa a limited defensive mission, and it wanted Tripolitania held and an Italian collapse prevented. So Rommel arrived with orders meant to stabilize the front, rather than chase a big victory. Hitler's focus was the Eastern Front, where Operation Barbarossa would supposedly decide the war. Rommel competed for every resource. Although Hitler made enthusiastic promises when Rommel's victories made headlines, High Command usually didn't support them with actual supplies. Kesselring, Halder, and other commanders consistently restrained Rommel's ambitions. In a post-war account, the fighting in North Africa was dismissed as Rommel's little shooting expedition, and that kind of language reflected how parts of the German leadership treated the theater as secondary. Some German planners tried to attach bigger meaning to the Desert War, with ideas sometimes called Plan Orient, and they imagined a wider drive into the Middle East and toward oil. But these concepts stayed mostly on paper, because the resources and the geography did not match the ambition. German planners discussed sending an SS unit that was meant for mass murder if the Axis reached Egypt and Palestine. But in North Africa, the reality was mainly persecution, deportations,
In camps run under Italian and Axis control, rather. Historical accounts describe German occupation forces in Benghazi looting Jewish property and deporting thousands for forced labor. And under Italian rule, many Cyrenian Jews were sent to the Giotto camp south of Tripoli, where disease and hunger killed many inmates. After German troops arrived in Tunisia, Tunisian Jews faced harsher persecution and forced labor. And at the same time, some Libyan Jews were expelled into Tunisia under Axis-era policies. So the suffering spread across borders in different ways. However, Plan Orient remained tentative. Few commanders considered it realistic. It's unclear from records if Einsatz's group and commanders ever met with Rommel. Overall, according to analyses of planning documents, German superiors struggled to integrate North Africa into a coherent strategy. It remained unclear what German victory would look like: simply preventing Italian collapse, capturing Tobruk, conquering Egypt. Nobody in Berlin could answer definitively. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front desperately needed resources. Stalingrad alone cost approximately 300,000 German soldiers, comparable to entire North African campaign losses across 2 years. For Britain, North Africa was the strategic focus for 1941 to 1943. After humiliating defeats in France, Singapore, and Greece, they needed victory somewhere. Churchill, according to accounts from staff, likely considered North African victory essential to political survival. In August 1942, he reportedly said, "Rommel, Rommel, what else matters but beating him?" Allied forces received the attention, supplies, and intelligence needed to succeed. Ultra-intelligence provided detailed information about Axis plans. Massive convoys brought American equipment. Reinforcements flowed from across the empire. When one side considers a theater a sideshow while the other considers it existential, the outcome becomes predetermined. North Africa had wider importance for allies. Operation Torch signaled serious American entry against Germany. Success exposed the soft underbelly, the southern approaches through Italy. Invasions of Sicily and Italy opened a second front Stalin demanded. For allies, defeating Rommel marked the start of a clear road to final victory. Though this road remained long and costly, North Africa was where it definitively began. For Germany, losing North Africa meant losing a sideshow. The real war continued in Russia. Rommel fought 3 wars simultaneously and could only win one. He was not defeated by lack of courage or imagination, but by the limits of what individual talent can achieve inside a broken system. In the tactical war of battlefield maneuver, Rommel demonstrated genuine brilliance repeatedly. His 1941 victories, Tobruk's capture, innovative combined arms tactics, these were real achievements. He understood speed, surprise, and concentration of force better than most of his opponents early in the campaign. He used armor, infantry, and artillery together in ways that confused British commanders who were still learning desert warfare. But tactical brilliance has limits. As British forces gained experience, as Montgomery accessed ultra-intelligence, as the Eighth Army learned from mistakes, Rommel's ability to exploit errors diminished. Once his opponents stopped making large mistakes, there was less room for bold improvisation, and the battlefield became less forgiving of risk. By El Alamein, geography eliminated his advantage. In a 40-kilometer corridor between sea and depression, tactical genius meant little. Battles became grinding attrition matches. There was no open flank to turn, no space to maneuver, and no surprise left to exploit. The desert stopped being a weapon and became a trap. Rommel won this first war repeatedly, but each victory cost fuel, ammunition, and irreplaceable losses his system couldn't afford. Every advance stretched supply lines further, and every tactical success made the next one harder to sustain. Industrial depth mattered more than battlefield skill, and Britain had it while Germany did not. The equation was brutal because the Axis had to haul supplies hundreds of miles across the desert from major ports, and heavy tanks burned fuel fast. So every mile forward increased the cost of simply staying in place, while the Eastern Front kept demanding the same resources. Every kilometer forward increased the cost of staying there, and every loss was harder to replace. He understood mathematics. Understanding didn't change them. This war was lost before the first shot. Knowledge without resources could not alter reality. Against his own high command's priorities, the Third War, Rommel fought a conflict that barely existed from Berlin's perspective. Jodel's dismissal of Rommel's little shooting expedition captured how German planning viewed the theater. North Africa was never central to German strategy, only a distraction. Meanwhile, Churchill's question, Rommel,
Rommel, what else matters but beating him, revealed how differently Britain viewed the same theater. For Britain, the Mediterranean was strategic, psychological, and political. When one side considers your theater peripheral while the other considers it existential, tactical brilliance cannot overcome that imbalance. Effort follows priority, and priority shapes outcomes. Hans Klein, breaking his rifle over a tree while his company sang, captured the end. We hadn't had anything to eat for a couple of days, since there was nothing coming through. The water supply was good, but there was no ammunition to continue the fight. Morale collapsed not from fear, but from emptiness. No ammunition to continue. That sentence summarizes the entire campaign from Germany's perspective. The war ended not with defeat in battle, but with absence of means. Rommel won battles through tactical genius. He couldn't make ammunition appear when supply ships sank. He couldn't make Hitler care about North Africa more than Russia. He couldn't make geography provide maneuvering room at El Alamein. Leadership cannot replace logistics, strategy, or geography. Wars are won by systems, not individuals. The system that produced 30 shells for every German shell, that could absorb 100% casualties and return stronger, that considered North Africa primary focus while Germany considered it an afterthought, that system was always going to win. Industrial capacity, strategic clarity, and logistical depth decided the outcome. Germany lost because Rommel fought 3 wars. He won one brilliantly, he lost one mathematically, he never had a chance in the third. Each war demanded something different, and only one rewarded genius. In total war, that's not enough. If you found this story of tactical brilliance versus industrial reality compelling, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the strategic decisions that shaped World War II. Next time, we'll explore how Allied forces turned North African lessons into the blueprint for D-Day. Don't miss it. Hit that subscribe button now.